Hey everybody, welcome back to my reading of Karlson Flies Again. So today, as I said last time, this is the last chapter of the book, and it's a small one at that, a little bit shorter than I usually read. But nonetheless, it should be an interesting chapter since it's the last one. And after this, I'll introduce our new book that I can't wait to read for you guys. But yeah, so last chapter, chapter 10 of Karlson Flies Again. And it's called Handsome, Thoroughly Clever, and Perfectly Plump. Smidge spent all that afternoon up at Karlson's house on the roof. He explained to Karlson why they really must leave Miss Crawley in peace. She's making a crumb cake, you know, for when Mum and Dad and Seb and Sally come home tomorrow. That was something Karlson could understand. Well, if she's making cream cake, then she has got to be left in peace. It's dangerous, irritating, creepy crawlies just when they're making cream cakes, because it turns the cream sour, and the creepy crawlies, for that matter. And so Miss Crawley's final hours with the Stevenson family turned out to be quite peaceful, just as she wished. Smidge and Karlson had a nice peaceful time, too, sitting in front of the fire up in Karlson's house. Karlson had flown over to the market and bought some apples. And honestly, paid for the whole lot with 5 ore, he said. I don't want any of those fruit stall women losing out on my account, because I'm the world's most honest Karlson. Did the fruit stall woman think 5 ore was enough then? Asked Smidge. I couldn't ask her, said Karlson, because she'd popped out for a coffee when I was there. Karlson threaded the apples on a length of wire and strung them over the fire to roast. The world's best apple roaster. Guess who's that, he said. You, Karlson, said Smidge. Then they sprinkled sugar on the apples and sat in front of the fire to eat them as darkness began to fall. It was good to have the fire, Smidge thought, because the weather was turning chillier. You could tell it was autumn. I shall have to take a little trip into the countryside and find a farmer to buy some more wood from, said Karlson. But they're devils for keeping their eyes peeled, and heaven only knows when they take their coffee breaks. He put 2 more big birch logs on the fire. But I've got to be nice and warm for the winter, or you can count me out, just in case they thought otherwise, those farmers. By the time the fire had burnt down, it was dark in Karlson's little house. Then he lit the oil lamp that hung from the ceiling above the carpentry bench. It spread a warm and cozy glow all over the room, and over all the stuff Karlson had piled up on the bench. Smidge asked if he could have a little look through Karlson's stuff, and Karlson agreed. But you've got to ask me if you can borrow things. Sometimes I'll say yes, and sometimes I'll say no. But mostly I'll say no, because they're my things, after all, and I want to keep them. Or you can count me out. And once Smidge had asked enough times, Karlson let him borrow an old, broken alarm clock to take apart and put back together again. It was fun, and Smidge couldn't think of a better plaything. But then Karlson wanted them to do some carpentry instead. That really is the best fun of all, and you can make such nice things, said Karlson, or I can at any rate. He threw all the stuff off the carpentry bench and rummaged out some boards and blocks of wood he kept under the bed. Then Karlson and Smidge set the room singing as they planed, and hammered and nailed for dear life. Smidge nailed together 2 chunks of board and made a steamboat. He put a little block of wood on top for a funnel. It was a really great boat. Karlson said he was going to make a nesting box and put it under the eaves of his house for little birds to live in. But it didn't turn out altogether like a nesting box. More like a something else that you couldn't quite put a name to. What is it? Asked Smidge. Karlson put his head on one side and looked at what he'd made. It's a what's it, he said. A really first-rate little what's it. Guess who's the world's best what's it makers? You, Karlson, said Smidge. But it was evening now. Smidge had got to go home and go to bed. He'd have to leave Karlson in his little room, so homely with all its piles of stuff, and its carpentry bench, and smoking oil lamp, and boxwood, and open hearth, where the embers of the fire were still glowing warm and bright. It was hard to tear himself away, but he knew he'd be able to come again, after all. Oh, he was so glad Karlson's house was on his roof, and nobody else's. They went out onto the front porch, Karlson and Smidge. A sky full of stars was stretched out above them. Smidge had never seen so many stars, so big and so close. Well, not really close, of course, because there were millions of miles away. He knew that, but still. Oh, what a roof of stars Karlson had on his house. Close, but far away at the same time. "What are you gaping at?" said Karlson. "I'm freezing cold. Are you flying home or not?" "Yes, please," said Smidge. And the next day, what a day it was. First Seb and Sally came home. Then Dad, and finally, and best of all, Mom. Smidge threw himself into her arms and hugged her. He would never let her leave again. They all stood around her in a ring. Dad and Seb and Sally and Smidge and Miss Crawley and Bumble. "Aren't you exhausted any more?" asked Smidge. "How did you get better so quickly?" "I got over it when I read your letter," said Mom. "When I heard about you all having scarlet fever and being in quarantine, I decided it would make me even more poorly if I couldn't come home." Miss Crawley shook her head. "That really wasn't very sensible, Miss Stevenson. But I can come to help out now and then, if you need me. Now, though," said Miss Crawley, "I've got to leave right away because I'm going to be on TV this evening." This came as a big surprise to Mom and Dad and Seb and Sally. "Really?" said Dad. "This we must see, definitely." Miss Crawley tossed her head proudly. "Yes, I hope you will. I hope the whole of Sweden will." Then she had to get moving. "Because I've got to have my hair done and have a bath and a facial and a manicure and then try out some new art supporters. You have to look smart if you're going to be on TV." Sally laughed. "Art supports, but they won't show on television, will they?" Miss Crawley gave her a disapproving look. "Did I say they would? I need some new ones anyway. And you feel more confident if you know you're perfect from top to toe. Though ordinary folk may not understand that. But we know, those of us on TV." She said a hasty goodbye and hurried out. "That was Creepy Crawly, then," said Seb as the door shut behind him. Smidge nodded thoughtfully. "I quite like her," he said. "She'd made them a lovely big cake with lots of cream on top and bits of pineapple inside. Let's have it with our coffee this evening while we watch Miss Crawley on television," said Mom. So that was what they did. As the thrilling hour approached, Smidge rang for Karlson. He pulled on the string behind the curtain, giving a single tug, which meant, "Come straight away," and Karlson came. By then the whole family was sitting around the TV. The coffee tray was all ready, and the cream cake was on the table. "Here we are, me and Karlson," said Smidge, as they came into the room. "Here I am," said Karlson, throwing himself into the best armchair. "I hear there's some cream cake on offer here, and not before time. Can I have a bit straight away, or rather a lot?" "Little ones have to wait their turn," said Mum. "And that's my seat, by the way. You and Smidge can sit on the floor at the front, and I'll bring you your cake there." Karlson turned to Smidge. "Did you hear that? Does she boss you about like that all the time, poor boy?" Then he smiled contentedly. "I'm glad she bosses me about, too, because it has to be fair, or you can count me out." So they sat on the floor in front of the television. Karlson and Smidge ate lots of cake while they were waiting for Miss Crawley. "Here she comes," said Dad. And he was right. There she was, and Mr. Peck, he was presenting the program. "Creepy Crawly, as large as life," said Karlson. "Now we'll have some fun." Miss Crawley gave a start. It was almost as if she could hear Karlson, or maybe she was just nervous, because she was about to stand in front of the whole of Sweden and demonstrate Hilda's spicy special. "Well now," said Mr. Peck, "how did you get the idea for this particular spicy stew?" "Well now," said Miss Crawley, "when you've got a sister who can't cook to save her life—" She didn't get any further. Karlson reached out a podgy little hand and switched off the TV set. "Creepy Crawly comes and goes exactly as I want her to," he said, but Mum said, Switch it back at once, and don't do that again or I shall send you out. Karlson nudged Smidge and whispered, Can't we do anything in this house anymore? Quiet, we're watching Miss Crawley, answered Smidge. You have to put in plenty of salt and pepper and curry to make it taste really good, said Miss Crawley. She sprinkled away, and the salt and pepper and the curry powder flew everywhere, and once the spicy special was ready, she looked roguishly out of the screen at them and said, Perhaps you'd all like to try it. Not me, thanks, said Karlson, but if you give me their names and addresses, I'll go and get a couple of those fire eaters as children for you. Then Mr. Peck thanked Miss Crawley for coming and showing them how to make her delicious spicy special, and that seemed to be the end of the show. But Miss Crawley piped up, Well now, could I just say hello to my sister at home in Frey Street? Mr. Peck looked doubtful. Well now, I suppose so, if you're quick. Then Miss Crawley waved into the camera and said, Hello, Frida, how are you? I hope you haven't fallen off your chair. I hope so too, said Karlson, because we've had quite enough earthquakes in northern Northern. What do you mean? Asked Smidge. After all, you don't know whether Frida is as solid as Miss Crawley. Oh, yes I do, said Karlson. I've been round to Frey Street a couple times for a spot of haunting. Then Smidge and Karlson had some more cream cake and watched a juggler on TV. He could keep 5 plates in the air at the same time without dropping a single one. Jugglers were pretty boring, really, thought Smidge, but Karlson sat there transfixed, so Smidge was happy. Everything was good at the moment, and it was just great having everybody there. Mom and Dad and Seb and Sally and Bumble and Karlson, of course. Once the cake was all gone, Karlson picked up the elegant cake plate. He carefully licked it clean, then he threw it up into the air like the juggler had. Like the juggler had done with his plates. Fair enough, he said. That bloke on the TV wasn't bad at all. But guess who's the world's best plate thrower? He threw the plate so high it almost hit the ceiling, and Smidge's heart sank. No, Karlson, stop it! Mom and the others were watching a dancer on the screen and didn't notice what Karlson was up to. And Smidge saying, Stop it, didn't help. Karlson casually carried on throwing. Nice cake plate you've got, by the way, said Karlson, hurling it up to the ceiling. Or had, I should say, he said, as he bent down to pick up the pieces. Oh, well, it's a mere trifle. But Mom had heard the crash as the plate smashed. She gave Karlson a smart wallop on the backside and said, That was my best cake plate, and it's not a mere trifle. Smidge didn't like Mom doing that to the world's best plate thrower, but he did realize she was upset about her plate, and he wasted no time in comforting her. I'll get the money out of my piggy bank and buy you a new plate. But then Karlson stuffed his hand in his pocket and fished out a little 5-öre piece, which he gave to Mum. I pay for my breakages myself. Here you are, my pleasure. Buy a plate and keep the change. Well, thanks, Karlson, said Mum. Karlson nodded and looked pleased with himself. Or buy a couple of cheap vases with it. Then you can throw them at me if I happen to come along and you happen to get cross. Smidge cuddled closer to Mum. You're not cross with Karlson, are you, Mum? Then Mum patted Karlson and Smidge and said she wasn't really. After that, it was time for Karlson to say goodbye. Hey, St. Hobson, I've got to get home now, or I'll be late for my evening meal. What are you having? Asked Smidge. Karlson on the roof's spicy special, said Karlson. But not that rat poison Creepy Crawly makes. Believe me, the world's best spicy specializer. Guess who's that? You, Karlson, said Smidge. Later, Smidge was in bed, with Bumble in the basket beside him. They'd all been in to say goodnight. Smidge was getting sleepy, but he lay there thinking about Karlson and wondering what he was going to do now. Maybe he was doing a bit of carpentry, making a nesting box or something. Tomorrow, when I get home from school, thought Smidge, I shall ring Karlson and ask him if I can come up and do a bit more carpentry too. It was so useful that Karlson had rigged up the ingenious bell system, thought Smidge. I could ring him now if I wanted, Smidge realized, and it suddenly seemed like a very good idea. He jumped out of bed, ran on bare feet over to the window and tugged the string 3 times. That was the signal for, just imagine there being somebody in the world as handsome and perfectly plump and brave and great in every way as you, Karlson. Smidge lingered by the window. Not because he was expecting an answer, but he just stood there anyway. And Karlson did come. Yes, just imagine that, he said. Not a word more. Then he flew back up to his little green house on the roof. And that is the end of Karlson Flies Again. A wonderful book. It's one of my favorites, and this actually also marks the end of my reading of any sort of Karlson stories. There is actually a third book, but I think we've had enough of Karlson for now, and if you'd like, please get the third one. The first one we read is called Karlson on the Roof, and this one is Karlson Flies Again. So I don't remember what the third one is called, but you can look that up. Now, before I finish here, I wanted to introduce our next book that I'm going to be reading, and it's a very, very, very famous Swedish, maybe it's become a folktale now, a Swedish story by the name of The Wonderful Adventures of Nils, by Selma Lagerlöf. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story about also a boy and his animals and his whole story. And it's one of the most famous actually books of written from Sweden, and it's wonderful. But I actually haven't read it myself, so I can't say much. I don't know exactly what it's about. I do, however, know that it's about the wonderful adventures of Nils. So I hope you enjoyed Karlson, and please come back next time for the first chapter or 2 of The Wonderful Adventures of Nils. And have a wonderful Thanksgiving.